I got to tell you, when Sean invited me to come back for the sixth Sunday after the Epiphany, I had not yet looked at that gospel. Not exactly the happiest one we could have had for you guys this morning. This morning, I kind of want to give you a winter rerun. Basically, because when I hear this particular gospel from Matthew, three things always come to mind, always. The first is the fact that on occasion I really wish I would have gone to law school instead of seminary. It would have been more pleasant than preaching on this. The second thing comes from a clergy retreat with Bishop Otis Charles, a dear friend who ordained me a priest 39 years and 8 days ago. And then the third comes from a very sad moment that I had in college as a student. Now, some of you have heard these two stories, as I told them a few years ago, but even so, they do seem worth retelling, as I think they exemplify what Jesus was saying if we take the resurrection into account, which is always what we have to do around here, and that is take the resurrection into account. This reading from the Gospel according to Matthew is terribly complex. There's a lot in it. And part of the complexity of it is he's talking to people about the law. And if in fact they're going to follow the law to the letter and then think of themselves as justified, they're in trouble. Because it's basically what's in the heart that of course compels us to do what we're doing. And therefore, it comes out with that kind of stuff, which must have just sent them, running for the hills. Anyway, I'm going to do a little bit of picking and choosing from the text, and then I'm going to drop down to the book of Deuteronomy for a visit. All this for the purpose of showing two ways to deal with division and separation, which are the world's words for sin. Decades ago, at a clergy retreat in the Diocese of Utah, where I was for 20 years, the following happened. We were a very small, exceptionally small clericus, and so everybody knew each other really well. And while that lent itself to having great discussions and lots of fun, including playing hearts and bridge well into the night, accompanied by a wee dram of Jack Daniels or two, it was also possible for us to get into rousing arguments with one another. And I had one of those with Bishop Charles one morning during that clergy get-together over the stupidest thing. While the two of us were setting up for the 7 o'clock Holy Eucharist, he asked me to lead the psalm, and for some reason this particular psalm, as they sometimes are in our readings, had been broken up into a bunch of clumps of verses in which many then were skipped, and you would go to the next clump. I don't know why I picked that very moment to tell him how much I disliked the practice, and rather than just letting the issue go, having raised it, I went on and on and on and on and on. Could have been that I was 26 years old. That might have, and I'd just come out of seminary, so by God, I knew this sort of stuff, I guess. Well, one thing led to another, and we got into this incredible shouting match. One of only two that I had with him over the 7 years that he was my bishop. Otis worked about 30 feet down the hall from me, so we saw each other every day many, many, many times. Dear friends. Anyway, as the clergy started to file in for the service, off the two of us went to our opposite corners in the church grumbling. And then in mere minutes it came time for the psalm. And I led it as he requested and then thought, well, at least we're done with that, thank God. We made it to the piece by avoiding each other, but then the bishop lobbed the following offertory sentence into the service that's taken from this morning's gospel. And this is how it reads in the prayer book. If you are offering your gift at the altar and there remember that your brother has something against you, leave your gift there before the altar and go first, be reconciled to your brother, and then come and offer your gift. And I thought, oh my, he had to pick that one. And with that, Bishop Charles left the altar as the celebrant, came way over to me and apologized. And the craziest part of this whole thing was I was the one who needed to apologize to him, which I then did. And we gave each other a big hug, and we were nicely reconciled, leaving, of course, the rest of the fellow clergy in the room wondering what that was all about. And we never told them. That was the fun part. When I think of Bishop Charles, I recall I just couldn't stay mad at the guy because he never gave arguments time to fester. That was the way that he operated throughout his life. He always sought reconciliation because he knew what a waste of time it was to remain divided over something. After all, when you are divided, you're not doing God's work or having fun, which more often than not is exactly the same thing. So that's one reflection to this morning's reading, dealing with alienation from one another or sin. And that story, of course, has a very good ending. Now, let me repeat a not so cheerful story about an event which happened when I was a student living at the University of Washington in Seattle. And some of you, of course, are going to remember this story from a past sermon. One day, this preacher showed up for a revival. What could possibly go wrong? And while I did not attend it, hundreds of others did. And that particular speaker took his text from what we had in Matthew this morning, preached vigorously on it, and reportedly harshly. Shortly afterwards, a student who had attended this revival went down to the canal connecting Lake Washington and Lake Union, which was a couple blocks from my dorm. I could look out my window and see it. And somehow, this student proceeded to sever a hand and then poke out an eye. Imagine being the parents of that student getting the call from the campus police that night. I remember reading the story in the University Daily the next morning, wondering what could ever compel someone from doing that? What kind of judgment just climbed into his body and just beat him to death? Well, this preacher, thank God, never showed up again, at least while I was there, and it was clear from the reaction of the university community that this guy who swooped into town to evangelize with good news was not a harbinger at all of good news in the slightest degree. It's all about judgment. Now, if you're going to be true to the season of Epiphany, if you're going to be an image of Christ's manifestation to the world, you have to wonder what is truly the best way to deal with division and separation and alienation. Again, what the church calls sin. Now, one way, of course, is that we can take a page from that man who came to Seattle and figuratively beat people to death for all sorts of things, including from this morning's reading, getting divorced. And when done with that, we can condemn to hell someone who looks a little too long at another whom he or she finds attractive. But I don't think that's the way the faith should deal with people for whom the dailiness of life can be trying in ways that are great or in ways that are small. I think instead of judgment, people are out there just craving joy because that is what indeed conquers despair. Joy. Case in point. I was once standing at a checkout line at a Smith's Food. Again, this was in Salt Lake City. And I had a single helium balloon in my hand. I think I was going to probably tie it to a mailbox or something. Maybe we were having a party that night. I can't remember. Anyway, I was in my black suit, wearing my clerical collar, probably looking fairly serious, I suppose, when out of the blue, the balloon went popped. Now I'm holding this limp string. A checker 2 or 3 stations down from where I was, and this was at 5:30 in the afternoon, so there were lots of people there. Anyway, this checker yelled over at me, "So, Father, looking at the cover of Cosmopolitan magazine again?" Chances were I was. It provoked that reaction. We are all human. We are all human. Quite simply, we can choose to engage in judgment, or we can instead act as my bishop did and seek reconciliation while still honestly acknowledging that we are imperfect people who sometimes do alienate each other and God. Such an approach is not to gloss over injury. Instead, though, we are to acknowledge our fault, seek forgiveness with such repentance, leading the wounded to come back together as one with God and one with each other in God. Now, off to Deuteronomy for just a minute. Always before us is life and prosperity as well as death and judgment. If we want to stick with judgment, making our case, winning at all costs, and showing who's boss by God, we're going to be stuck with only that momentary thrill of victory. But in the long run, the prize of such action is death, because it leaves one separated from another. Or we can give ourselves over to life, which is enjoyed in harmony with one another, the fruit of working at reconciliation. Now, the final thing I want to say this morning is that we are asked to do this not only so that we can live, but that others may live as well. I return us to that moment at that clergy conference probably 37 years ago. Regarding our argument, Bishop Otis Charles was right. The way he wanted the psalm read that morning was how those who wrote the 1979 Book of Common Prayer, of which he was one, envisioned it to be. I didn't have a leg to stand on. And from that moment on, all the way to the end of his earthly life, 7 years ago on the day after Christmas, he could have spent that time proud and satisfied that he was the winner of that argument with one of the junior clergy of the cathedral. But remember, we're not ever called to be correct. We are not asked to be right. We are called by Christ to love one another and to act towards one another just steeped in that love, having it permeate every pore of our being. And because Otis listened to that, Jesus drew him to seek reconciliation with me. And for that, both of us were grateful because it restored us to being the brothers we already were in Christ all along. Such is a pretty persuasive reason, I think, to love as Christ loved us. So, with all the above in mind, when we look at the joy we can share through reconciliation, and then we look at the choice between life and death, it really is hardly rocket science to choose life. Amen.